So we had the excitement this week of going down to Portland on Wednesday and seeing our son Matthew move into an apartment after having been homeless for a long period of time. And as we were doing things, to help him, he goes, I got to tell you guys, he goes, you guys have become so laid back as compared to the way you were when I was a kid. And I said, well, there's a logical reason for that. Because when you were a kid, we were actually responsible for you. We were responsible for, your safety and your welfare and getting you prepared for the future. And so that was why we seemed like we were very uptight people. But now we don't have any responsibility. It's not that we don't care. It's just that we don't have that responsibility. That's not on our shoulders. So now you get to see us as we really are, as the people we were before we became uptight parents worried about your future. And so that was quite the revelation for him. And I told him, I said, part of the relationship that all people go through is they get to the point where, there is the parent and the child relationship where the child was really small and you had to, direct everything that they did and maintain control. I said, but then when you reach adulthood, all of that's gone. Now you can just relate to your parents as you would relate to any other adult that you would know. And there's still, that connection of being a child and a parent relationship, but it's not the same thing as it was before. That has completely changed. And kind of the root or the thread that goes through all of this is love. And so we're actually going to be discussing how to love better. That's going to be really what the topic of the sermon is going to be. Now, the picture that I chose to illustrate this, which if you can't see real well where you are, depending on how it looks to you, it might look like a drain, and it might look like the word love better is going down the drain. That's not meant to be the image that you get from it. This is actually a spiral staircase. And the idea here is that as you go down the staircase, you keep going to another level and another level and another level. And so what we're going to find as we go through the sermon passage this week, that there are a number of levels that you go through of things that you have to deal with so that you can actually love better. So I want you to know what the symbolism is of this particular picture. Our key question is, what keeps you from loving others the way Christ loves you? I mean, we know how God loves us when we look at everything that we've ever thought or done and the decisions we made and stuff like that, and yet we find out that God still loves us anyway and that his kingdom is still near and available to us. When we see how he loves us, he meets us where we're at, and he's so patient with us and he's so forgiving with us. When we see that, and then we find out that, well, we don't actually treat other people that way. Somehow we fall short of that. So what is it that's keeping you from loving others the way Christ has loved you? That's our question that we want to wrestle with today. Now, our key idea is that sin is a love killer. And we're going to see that in the passage, and we're going to see some of the sins that actually kill love. And when we get to that part, this isn't so that you can look at somebody else and say, aha, see, that's wrong with you and that's wrong. No, it's not about so you can see what's wrong with somebody else. It's so that you can look at yourself and see what you bring into relationships that prevents you from actually loving the person the way God wants you to. So this is for you to be able to learn about you and to try to ask God what you need help in so that you can be a better person. So that's what this is going to be all about. Our sermon passage is in 1 Corinthians 13, verses 4 through 8. This is a very famous love passage that gets used all the time for all sorts of applications. It's on page 813 of the Pew Bible, if you want to look along there. And it's always taken out of context. And the reason why we're looking at this, because it's in context for what Paul is talking about. So for the previous 2 weeks, we've been talking about spiritual gifts. And Christians in certain circles get all excited about having spiritual gifts, and they're really excited about the fact that having a spiritual gift to them, is confirmation that they're in Christ and that God is with them and doing stuff, and they get all excited about this. But having a spiritual gift isn't about you. It's about you being able to glorify God by helping others. It's to equip you, essentially, to make a difference, to come alongside somebody and make a difference. And in so doing, God ends up being glorified. And when God is glorified, then the other person starts to give thanks and give praise to God, and they grow closer to God because of how God has equipped you to be helpful to them. So this idea of looking at love, this is really tied back into spiritual gifts. And Paul had said in last week's passage that I've got a better way for you. Spiritual gifts are good, but I got something that's even better for you. And so this is the part that's even better, and it's something that you want to use in the way that you minister to and that you help other people. So that's the context, and that's the context I'm going to be using to be able to talk about this today. So we start off at the beginning of verse 4, and it's really short and to the point. Love is patient and kind. That's it. That's the entire definition of love that Paul gives us. You think with a definition that short and to the point, well, that should be something that would be easy for us to be able to do. And yet, it seems to be something that's very difficult for us to be able to do. So being patient, when you look up the Greek word that's quoted as patient, that means being mild and being slow to anger. I wish I could say that that was me. And my son Matthew, when he was thinking that we were really uptight when he was growing up, he saw me when I was less than mild and very quick to anger. He saw that aspect of who I was. So he was in complete shock to find out that I'm not that way now. Being kind means being gentle. And I grew up, and I particularly had one family member who liked to make these sort of like remarks that were sort of like a knife that went in and would get twisted. Just had a way of just putting little zingers out there. And so that was one of the things that, you learn by example and by imitation. And so I had a tendency to do that when my kids were growing up as well. And so I realized that I was not mild, I was not slow to anger, and I wasn't always gentle. So I can stand before you and say that while I was raising kids, I failed on this count. I thought I was showing love, and the things that I had been taught were examples of love. I have since decided were not really so. So, I look at this and I see where I have fallen short of the glory of God. And so I tell you this so that you can look at this and examine yourself and be honest with you about where you have fallen short of the glory of God. So we move on in verse 4, and we move on to verse 5. And here we get to what I call the love killers. And I've studied this section before, and I've used it, and it was this week, and it was interesting because I knew when I prepared last week's sermon, I knew that I was going to go here for this week's sermon. And God had also told me that he was going to give me some new insight in spite of all of the study that I had done and how carefully I had put those studies together to be able to hand out to people and be able to teach things to people. I knew going into this that God was going to show me something and have me see it in a fresh new way. And he did. And this part here is where it really becomes fresh and new for me. Because when I look at this, I have not been seeing these things as love killers. So let's take a look at the verse. Love is not jealous or boastful or proud or rude. It does not demand its own way. It is not irritable, and it keeps no record of being wronged. And the thing that was really interesting to me is that I realized that it's sin that produces these 7 behaviors. I had never really looked at it from the point of view of this is sin. And if you and I are honest with ourselves, it is because of sin in us that we end up not being patient and kind with other people. These other things just kind of take over. and they control our behavior, they control our attitude, and people who are on the receiving end of these sinful attitudes never end up feeling loved. And we may think that we're showing love, but we're not showing love because we are instead practicing sin, and we don't realize that we're actually killing love in the process. So I didn't want to look at every single one of these words because this is not a Bible study, it is a sermon. So I didn't want to look at all of them, but I'm going to look at 3 of them in order to give you a sense of what they are. And I think that the 3 that I've chosen kind of helps to maybe flesh out what some of the others might be as well. So we start off, and the first one is jealousy. And the definition here is that it's a greedy mindset of envy and desire. The problem with jealousy is that we're looking at a situation and we're deciding that somehow we are being cheated out of something. In other words, most people won't come out and say to God, well, God, you failed. I was supposed to have this and you didn't give it to me. We wouldn't say that. But we have these emotions that come up in us, emotions that cause behaviors in us, and those are attitudes and behaviors that essentially say the same thing. We're saying that we understand better what we need than God understands what we need. And we're not satisfied with what God gives us. We think that we should have more. And so we end up putting ourselves ahead of God. We end up being the one that we trust more than we trust God. And when we trust anything more than God, that is, in essence, sin. So jealousy, that greedy mindset of envy and desire, that shouldn't be there. And yet it creeps into our lives. And there are other things on the list where you come up with, these wrong thoughts because of something, and it's all rooted in the same thing of, I think I should have, I think I deserve, I know what's better, what I need to have, I know better than God what I should have. And that's really kind of like the root of where sin is, where we put ourselves and our thoughts and our wants, and we think that we know better than God does. The next one is pride, an arrogant attitude of overinflated superiority. I like that definition, overinflated superiority. And that's something that we can take on, and believe it or not, pride can be so subtle. Which is why it's such an insidious sin, is that it can creep into us and we tend to not even be aware that it's happening. It usually takes something big that smacks us in the face and shows us that we're being prideful. We usually don't see ourselves as being prideful until it gets out of hand. So it's a very arrogant attitude, and it's thinking that you know better. And this is one of the reasons why it gets into the realm of sin. Because as soon as you think you know better, as soon as you think that you know more than God knows about something, and you're upset about that, then that is a matter of pride, which is one of the reasons why it says that God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Because a humble person is not going to have this overinflated sense of superiority. They're going to completely understand who and what they are, and who and what they are in relation to God. And this humility is going to cause them to say, I know my place with God. I am content in my place with God. And if God chooses not to give me something, I can accept that because I don't think that I know better than God does. And I don't think that I should have more than what God has given me. And I am willing to be content with what God allows me to have. So there's a lot that goes on with humility in relation to pride, or in opposition, I should say, to pride. So that's one of the sins, which is a love killer. We then get into the idea of forgiveness, choosing to forget faults and restore relationships. So people like to say, well, I'll forgive you, but I won't forget. What they're really saying is, I won't forgive you, because forgiveness means you actually willingly choose to forget. It's not that you're blind to things. It's not like you don't know that things are going on, but you choose to not look at that and make the big thing that you focus on. if you keep focusing on somebody else's faults, you are never going to be able to get to the place where you can love them in spite of their faults. You're never going to get to the place where you can actually overlook it and forgive their faults. And in the process, when the relationship is damaged, there'll be no opportunity to be able to restore the relationship and make it whole again. We all have faults. We all fall short of the glory of God. That's just the nature of who and what we are. So if we're not practicing forgiveness to the people that are closest to us in our lives, if we're not practicing forgiveness to the people that we know in church, and if we're not practicing forgiveness to the people that we work with and that we know in our community, if we're not willing to practice forgiveness, then there will never be an opportunity to have whole, working, functional relationships. Those relationships, when they get damaged, will always stay damaged. And God doesn't want that. And so God practices forgiveness with us so that we can understand what forgiveness looks like. So because he has been willing to forgive us, he wants us to be able to practice that as well. And so now I think you can see where that's going to be an absolute love killer. Because how are you going to end up being patient and kind when you are remembering everything that somebody has done that you're supposed to love, and you're holding a grudge that you're not willing to let go of? It's very hard to nurse a grudge and be patient and kind at the same time. We just don't have the ability to be able to do that. So this sin is very much a love killer. You can say the words, I love you. You can, do a few acts, of and I would say cultural acts of love, whether it's, buying a bouquet of flowers or doing something like that, a box of chocolates. You can do these things that the culture says are statements of love. But the real statements of love are when you recognize the sin in you and you go before God and you actually ask God to help you not have that sin control you, because you want to be able to love another person the way they need to be loved. That's the only way that you can really show love. Now, when we get to SoulFlex on Thursday, guys, we're going to be taking a look at this in a much more embarrassing sort of a way, because it says, can you see how your sin affects others, if other people feel loved? In other words, can you look at the sin that you can see in yourself? So you got between now and Thursday to have a conversation with God and say, okay, God, show me the truth about me and help me to understand how this sin in me is affecting the way others in my life feel loved. That's one of the things that we're going to be doing on Thursday. So either we'll have nobody here on Thursday because it'd be too embarrassing and uncomfortable, or we'll have everybody here and everybody will be honest about things, and because they actually want to work out and make their lives better and make the lives of the people they care about better as well. Going on in verse 6. Now this changes. Before we were looking at sin, and now we want to look at God's values, because if you're going to be showing the patience and the kindness that is love, you're going to have God's values. We've already identified sin that gets in the way. Now we have to look at God's values. And verse 6 says, it does not rejoice about injustice, but rejoices whenever the truth wins out. So justice, that starts with you treating others right. So God is a just God. That's who he is. It's part of his nature. It's what he does. But because you and I are sinners, that really isn't part of our nature. It's not of what we do. We have a tendency to put ourselves first. We have a tendency to want to make sure that we get what we want for ourselves. And oftentimes when we do that, we produce injustice as a byproduct of that. So that people don't experience justice when they're with us. So if you actually have embraced God's value of justice, if you have looked at his nature of being just, and that has become a priority for you to be that, then you're on the step, an important path to being able to love other people. Now, it has become a big thing, and it has been for over a century, in the history of the church, to promote the idea of social justice. And social justice is good. But I remember back in my photocopier repairman days, I had a customer in Portland who ran a ministry that was supposed to be a social justice oriented ministry. Imagine my surprise when I found in the Portland newspaper a report that he had been arrested for the way he had been treating members of his own family, the unjust ways that he had been treating members of his own family. And that caused me to think at that time that you cannot try to promote social justice. That would be justice, out and beyond yourself. You cannot promote social justice unless you're actually practicing justice in your own world. This person was not practicing justice in their own world, and eventually it destroyed the ministry that was attempting to promote social justice elsewhere. You can't do both. So you have to start in your own little circle. You have to start where you are and the people that you have the most contact with. And those are the people that you need to do things day in, day out, where you are producing justice. You are acting justly towards them. And when you can do that where it's closest to you, it'll become part of who you are, and you'll start to do that everywhere else as well. So having God's value of justice is really important, and that's a key to being able to practice love with people. It also says that it rejoices whenever the truth wins out. So the truth is about being honest about you, to you, and to others. In other words, what I'm saying here is that you're going to be honest about you. So when you're just like inside your own head and thinking about things and being, having a chance to, recognize what you do and what effect that it has on other people, and whether it's a sin or whether it's not a sin, whether it's self-centered or whether it's other-centered, whether it's putting God at the center of your life and trusting Him alone, or whether it's you choosing to trust something about you instead of trusting God. If you are being honest with you about this, that's the first step. But the next step is also to be honest about yourself to others. I try to practice that every time I preach. If there's something that I can say about myself which falls short of the glory of God, I admit that and I confess that, because how can I ask you to practice truth and honesty if I am not willing to practice truth and honesty in front of you as an example? And I'm doing that because I want you to be able to take on God's value of truth, and I want you to elevate that to make it your value of truth. Because I know when you practice truth about yourself to you, and then you practice truth about yourself to others, then you are going to end up owning your sin. You're going to end up confessing your sin. You're going to end up repenting of your sin. You're going to end up asking God to forgive you of your sin. You're going to end up asking God to help you to deal with the sin so that you don't have to do that sin anymore. And that is going to end up transforming or changing the nature of your life. It starts with you being truthful and honest with you. And the biggest thing that I have ever seen in my life with people who have like substance abuse issues and other types of issues is that they always point the finger. It's because of this, it's because of that, it's because of somebody else. It's never because of themselves. It's not because they chose to do something. It's because somebody else was doing something to them. And they make excuses. One of the reasons why Christianity is so transforming in people's lives is once a person is restored into a relationship with God and they feel completely safe and comfortable in that relationship, they get to the place where they can start practicing truth and honesty. And that willingness to practice truth and honesty before God and before themselves, knowing that nothing will ever take them away from the love of God. That truth before God is not going to cause God to say, oh, well, now that I know that, I'm done with you. Because God knew that all beforehand anyway. He knows it all. He still chooses to love you in spite of the fact that He knows everything there is to know about you. So you can afford to be truthful to God, and you can afford to be truthful to yourself, and that is transforming, because once people start being truthful and honest, they're in a place to start seeking God's help to be able to change and transform their lives. So these values are extremely important. and they will make a huge difference to your ability to be able to be patient and kind with other people. Then he gives a couple essential attitudes that you have to have in order to be able to do this. He says, love never gives up, never loses faith, is always hopeful, and endures through every circumstance. So, he's basically saying that it never gives up, and it's enduring. So the idea here is that because love is supposed to be faithful, but it's only possible when we are both hopeful and willing to endure. So hopefulness is the confident expectation of wish fulfillment. In other words, you have a hope for somebody that you care about. And in that hope, you want what's best for that person. You might have to wait 20 years, 50 years, whatever, for any change to happen in that person's life so that positive things can start happening. But the idea here is that you are hopeful. You never stop being hopeful. God is always hopeful where you're concerned. That's an important part of the attitude that he brings to the gift of salvation through Christ. It is that hopeful attitude that you can seek him, you can ask for his help, and you can be changed. And he knows this can happen for you. You have to want it. You have to ask for it. But if you want it and you ask for it, that is something that will happen. So God has this confident expectation that his desires can be fulfilled. He knows they can be fulfilled. He knows you can refuse to accept his gift. He knows you can turn your back on him. He knows you can choose to face judgment in the worst possible way. He knows you can do that. But he also knows it can turn the other way. He knows this. And you have to have this attitude where you know that somebody can change. One of the things that was very interesting about our experience down in Portland was that there was a gentleman who was part of another ministry who had to come by and see our son's new apartment and bring some food by to share with him. And he said, he goes, it was about 2 months or so ago, 3 months, that he noticed a change in our son. And when he saw that change, he knew that something important had happened in him. And it was just so interesting because that was about the same time that our son started reaching out to us on a regular basis. Before that, it would be, you'd hear from him once in a year, and he'd say, oh yeah, we should get together and have a meal. And, okay, I got to find a day where I can do that, so call me back when you're ready. And he'd go, okay, I'll do that. And then you wouldn't hear from him for another year. This went on for years like this, but this change finally took place. And this fellow saw the change, and he saw that the change seemed to be consistent. And everybody who worked with the homeless down in the Portland area could see this change in him. And it was because of that change that things started moving so that he could get off the streets and get into a program to have a home to live in. We had to live for a lot of years. I mean, I've been here in this church for about 16 years. So when I get to my anniversary, that will be a full 17 years that we've been here. Okay, so pretty much for the entire 16 plus years that we've been here, we've been living with this hanging over our head of the problems that he has. The only way we can function with this is by being hopeful, by thinking we know what we want for him, we know what can happen for him, and never losing heart that eventually will happen, and always be ready, willing, and able to meet him where he's at when he is ready for us to do that. Who is in your life, maybe not as dire a situation as that, but who in your life do you need to be hopeful for? What in your life do you need to be hopeful about? No change is ever going to happen unless you have this attitude of hopefulness. This is really important. Does that mean that you're not going to become discouraged along the way and frustrated and just think to yourself, I'm not so sure anything is ever going to change? Yeah, we'll have those moments where we think that. We're people. We're human. We have that. But then once you get past that kind of frustrated emotion, you get back to the place where you go, okay, but I'm still here. I'm still ready. I'm still willing. I'm still able. to help out when the opportunity comes. So hopefulness is really important. Endurance is about standing firm even in suffering. So it means that in suffering, you're going to stand firm in a couple of different ways. Number one, you're going to stand firm in what I just said about being available and willing and ready. But it also means standing firm on what you know is right and true. It doesn't mean that you give up what's right. It just means that you're not going to press certain points until it's the right time to press those points. You're going to stand firm even in the middle of the suffering. You're not just going to throw your hands in the air and walk away and have nothing to do with anything. It may seem that way at times to people who are on the receiving end, but sometimes you just have to say, it's not my responsibility to enable you to keep doing the things that destroy you. So it's going to look like I've thrown my hands in the air, but I haven't really done that. What I've done is I've stepped aside a little bit so that you can have the freedom to do what you want to do the way you want to do it until you decide that you've had enough of that and you want to be done with that and you really want to have your life changed. That's what endurance is. It means that you are not going to just allow yourself to be a doormat and to be walked all over by somebody. It means that when somebody is in a place where they are not willing to face the truth about themselves and work with it, you just go, okay, there's no choice. I don't want to enable them, so I'm going to have to step back and give them their space until they are ready to change. And when they reach out and show that they are ready to change and be different, then I'm right there. I haven't given up. I'm still hopeful. So these attitudes are essential in order for you to be able to show love to somebody. None of this is easy, but it is necessary. And when you're doing it, it's part of what patience is. Patience is not necessarily going along with everything to say, well, it's what you wanted, so sure, let me give you this and let me give you that. Sometimes patience is, well, I guess this is where you're going to be at for a while. And being kind is you're not going to call them names and put them down and accuse them of, being a loser and a failure. You're still going to be kind. You're still going to talk about what they offer that's positive, that can make a difference. What qualities you see that when they're ready to go beyond where they're at, that you are going to see those qualities come back out again, because that is who they are. It's what's inside them. So being kind is looking for the positives that you can show to somebody in the middle of everything that they are doing which is not good for themselves. It's a hard place. Showing real love is a hard thing to do. It's not something that comes easy. And it's not something that any of us does well. It's something that we keep having to work at to be able to get good at in order to be able to do. So these are, some of the things that get in the way of being able to love others as Christ has loved us. But then we get to verse 8, which is, the final verse for this particular sermon. And it's in here because it's the context reminder. It brings us right back around. This is the verse. Remember, he was talking about spiritual gifts before this. And now he's just finished talking about love, and he brings us around. And so when you're thinking about spiritual gifts, you're thinking about, I've got to show and practice all of these things of love as part of using my spiritual gift that God has given me. I don't just use a spiritual gift. I don't just lay a hand on somebody. I don't just do something. I do something, and it's being done in the context of everything that I've just talked about today. You are going to bring love into the mix of the spiritual gift that God has given you. So this is a context reminder. And verse 8 says, prophecy and speaking in unknown languages and special knowledge will become useless, but love will last forever. You see that he brings it right back around. And so he says it's going to become useless, which means that right now it's useful. That's an important thing to realize, that in the time period that we live in this moment before Christ returns, when we're supposed to be sharing the gospel and helping others to come to know who Christ is and to come to that place where they're willing to trust in God for their salvation. In this context of the world that we're in right now, he's saying that all of the spiritual gifts are useful. They're not going to be useful forever, but they're useful in this particular time period. And they're useful for a particular reason. Not just to make you feel good about you. That's not what the spiritual gifts are about. It's not so that you can feel proud of yourself and feel confident in yourself. It's so that you can be equipped to do something that God wants to have done to help somebody else, because he wants them to be pointed to him. He wants them to see that he has the solution to their issue through faith in Christ. That's what God wants. So during this time period, spiritual gifts are useful. But guess what? When this age ends, when Christ returns, when judgment is over with, when we are spending eternity in heaven with God, guess what there's still going to be? Love. Love is still going to be useful, because love is still going to be a part of the mix, because love is who God is. God is love. And so love never is outdated. The things that he gives us to be able to serve him now, that comes, that goes. When we have it, great. If we don't have it, so what? But love is one of those things that you can always have. So that's an important idea for you to look at what love is and how to practice it and realize that you use it in the context of the spiritual gift. So you come alongside somebody and God tells you, here's a person who has a need. I want you to help meet the need. I have equipped you so that you can help meet the need. But meeting the need is only valuable and only important if you are able to practice patience and kindness to that person. If you can show them love, then your gift is going to become useful, because they are going to see that what you're doing, it's an expression of love. It's an expression of God's love. So all of that other stuff that was part of love, that's all of the junk that either gets in the way or that you need to wrestle with to understand so that you can actually be patient and kind. That's really all that is. That's so that you can examine yourself, be honest about you to you, and then ask God to work on and to change the things where you fall short of his glory. So what is our truth nugget? Love is eternal. Spiritual gifts are temporary. That's like, a big truth that we get from this passage. Love is eternal. Spiritual gifts are temporary. They're valuable in the time that we're in right now, but they're not going to be valuable for eternity. In other words, you don't want to place such an emphasis on spiritual gifts that you are not putting enough energy into having a better, closer relationship with God. That's where your time and energy needs to be. And then you say, okay, and in part of my worship of God, and part of the way that I glorify you through the way I live and what I do, I want to have the spiritual gifts that make a difference in other people's lives so that they can be pointed back to you, Lord, and you can get the glory for what has been done. So that's what spiritual gifts are for, and love is the thing that makes it all work the way it's supposed to. Our takeaway, this is where you have a conversation with God and you say, Lord, show me my barriers to love. That's really what this whole message was about. It was about the barriers to love. And you don't conquer those barriers unless you talk to God and say, God will show it to me. You're probably going to show me things I don't want to see. You're probably going to show me things that I won't like. But I know, Lord, that when you show it to me, and when I'm honest with you about it, and when I come before you in humility, and I bow down before you, and I ask you for your help, you're going to show me how to trust you instead of trusting the barrier. You're going to show me how to be in a better relationship with you and how to let go of different sins that are killers of love. This is why it's important. You want God to show you what those are so that they can be done with, so they can be out of your life and not controlling you anymore.